Hey baseball fans, I'm Matt Gross, aka the Rhode Island Rocky fan, and welcome to the first Purple Row video segment of the year. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Major League contracts and some of the contracts that the Rockies have made in years past. Specifically the two big ones, the Tulowitzki contract and the Carlos Gonzalez contract. Specifically, more so the Tulowitzki one, because I think it represents something pretty big. We'll get to that in a second. So, over the last couple of weeks, I'm sure if you follow other teams across Major League Baseball, you've seen the news with the Justin Verlander contract, the Paul Goldschmidt contract, and the big one, really, the Buster Posey contract, where these players are either locked up long-term through their free agent years or a deal that covered the arbitration years where they wouldn't have to deal with that with the player in the Arizona Paul Goldschmidt case. But to me, it just represents a continuation of what we're seeing in Major League Baseball, and I think it's interesting from a Rocky fan perspective to look at how the Tulowitzki and Gonzalez deals really helped shape some of that, or at least were part of this sort of revolution we're seeing in the way business is conducted in Major League Baseball. So go back now, rewind a second to November of 2010, where the Rockies gave Tulowitzki that 6-year, $134 million extension, and then followed that up with a 7-year deal to Carlos Gonzalez. What I find interesting about that is and specifically the Tulowitzki deal, is how far away these players were from free agency, and then how much money and how many years they committed to these players after they were set to become free agents. And that's really where I think the Tulowitzki deal really takes hold. We saw places before this deal in 2010 where players had their free agent years bought out. The Rockies themselves actually bought out Tulowitzki's arbitration years after 1 year in the major leagues. And after the 2007 season, they signed him to an extension that brought out the first 2 years of free agency and all of his arbitration years, kept him in Colorado through 2014. We saw it with the Rays, with Evan Longoria, right after he came up. They signed him to a deal that covered all of his arbitration years. The Brewers, Ryan Braun, right after the Tulowitzki deal in 2008, they said the same thing, a deal that covered the first 2 or 3 years of his arbitration. The Red Sox with Dustin Pedroia did this after he won his MVP in 2008. They covered the arbitration years, bought out the first couple years of free agency. We've also seen deals before that, like the Joe Mauer deal, where he was 1 year, the opposite end, where he was 1 year away from free agency, and then the Twins handed him a $184 million contract to stay in Minnesota. So we kind of saw deals on both ends. But what was so interesting about the 2010/2011 offseason for the Rockies is here you had players who were many, many years away from free agency. And the Rockies said, you know what, we want you to be with us through the prime of your career right now. We know, we see what you are, we like what you are, and we want you to be here as long as possible. And in Tulowitzki's case, it was for 6 free agent years. And I think that's what caused many people in Major League Baseball to take a step back and say, well, wait a second, what's going on here? Because we hadn't seen anything like that in the past. In fact, I think one of the closest deals that you actually have to that in the past is the Todd Helton deal, if you go all the way back to April of 2001, where he was a couple years away from free agency, and then they gave him a $141 million contract. But what's interesting is that since that offseason, other clubs have pretty much followed what the Rockies have done. And I've got a list here in this post of all of the players who have had some sort of free agent years bought out by their own team in just the last 12 months. The list would be much, much longer if it went back to 24 or 36 months. I mean, because it's become the trend across Major League Baseball. But there's 3 deals specifically that highlight what the Rockies did with Carlos Gonzalez and Tulowitzki, where they were many years away from free agency, and they didn't matter. They signed him up anyway. One is Ryan Braun in the spring of 2011, just a few months after these deals went through for Colorado. Ryan Braun gets locked up by the Brewers through 2020. Last November, Evan Longoria, he was 5 years away from free agency. Didn't matter. The Rays knew they wanted him to be the franchise player. They wanted him to be the face of that franchise. They locked him up through 2023. And now this week, you see the Giants locking up Buster Posey through the end of the decade. So now you have these players, the Tulowitzkis, the Brauns, the Longorias, the Buster Poseys, best players in the game, and they're staying with the club they started with. And that represents a seismic shift across Major League Baseball, a seismic shift, because no longer do you look at these great players on mid-market teams and say, oh, I wonder how long it's going to be before he ends up on the Yankees, the Red Sox, the Phillies, or I guess now you throw the Dodgers into that group since they've entered the payroll behemoth group. But it's not going to be that way anymore, because now the stars in these solar systems are not going to be leaving those solar systems for the most part. They're going to be staying where they started. So now you basically have to take a step back and say, well, what does this mean? Well, I think two things. Number one, you are not going to see these great free agent markets anymore. You're just not, because these great players are just not going to get to free agency with the same flow that they once did, because they're all being locked up by their own teams. And two is it's going to represent a very, very interesting crossroads for teams like the Dodgers and the Yankees, who, interestingly enough, have some of the best players that are about to hit the free agent market. Robinson Cano with the Yankees after this season, Clayton Kershaw after two more seasons. Even the Red Sox with Jacoby Ellsbury, I don't quite put him in the same group, but he did have one of the best years that we've seen in the last several seasons in his 2011 campaign. So if we look at these teams, these teams represent the old way of doing business. Before, where you could basically just, if you were a big market team, you could just raid all the other teams' talent when they got to free agency, and there was nothing they could do about it. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see how they adjust to it, how much money they have to pay to Cano or an Ellsbury and Kershaw if they lock them up. I assume, at least with Cano and Kershaw, they're going to be locked up. It's going to cost a fortune because they were a little late to this party, but I'm pretty confident they're going to get those deals done. So one, it'll be interesting to see how much money they have to pay those guys, but it's also going to be really, really interesting to see where this leads Major League Baseball, because I see very, very little to stop this onrush toward a golden age of parity in this sport, because now you've created a way for the mid-market teams to compete. And again, it's not good news if you are a fan of the Yankees, Red Sox, or Dodgers, because I don't think that these enormous payrolls are going to be the advantage they used to be. But it's going to be very good news if you are a fan of parity, if you're a fan of chaos in September pennant races, if you're a fan of teams going from the top of the divisions to the bottom of the divisions and back to the top very, very quickly. That's where it seems like we're headed. All right, I'm already way over on time here, so hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be back next week with another round of Purple Row video. See you, everyone.